Please note, Night Terrors is for a mature audience only. Episodes may contain violent images and extreme gore.
Ah, there you are. Ready for another bedtime story? Of course you are. This one's a real heart-warmer. If your heart's into cold, endless space and a ship that's seen better days, you know the type. Stranded, crew not quite acting themselves, and a captain holding it together by a thread. But hey, who wouldn't lose it with a little cosmic isolation? So buckle up, we're heading into deep space, and remember, out here, no one can hear you scream, except maybe yourself.
The Galatea drifted through the cold, infinite void of space. A ghost ship lost in the dark. Its engines were dead, the once humming power that propelled it through the stars now silent. The ship's faint emergency lights flickered sporadically, casting long, ominous shadows down the empty corridors. There was no sound except for the groaning of the ship's aging metal as it twisted in the black abyss. The ship was alone, but it was not empty. Captain Jonas Harker sat slumped in his chair on the bridge, his face gaunt and his eyes bloodshot. His lips were cracked, his skin pale and slick with sweat. He hadn't eaten or drunk anything in days. The hollow pangs of hunger gnawed at him, and his body felt like it was shutting down. He could feel himself slipping, his mind teetering on the edge of sanity. But worse than the hunger or thirst was the silence. It bore down on him, oppressive and absolute. He reached out with a trembling hand, hitting the record button on the comms panel. His voice, when it came, was a dry rasp, barely more than a whisper.
This is Captain Jonas Harker of the Galatea. I've lost most of the crew. A microorganism we encountered on Helios Station has infected them. It's somehow bonded to their DNA, changing them at a genetic level, warping their bodies, twisting their minds. They aren't human anymore. I've barricaded myself on the bridge, but I can hear them outside. They're trying to get in. They won't stop. I don't know how much longer I can hold out, but I have to survive.
He cut the transmission and slumped back in his chair, his hands trembling. His stomach twisted painfully, reminding him of how long it had been since he last ate. His throat was dry, and each swallow felt like sandpaper. He needed food, water. He knew he couldn't stay on the bridge any longer. If he did, he'd die here, rotting in this chair while the infected clawed at the door. Harker stood, his legs shaky and weak. He grabbed the heavy maintenance wrench that lay by his side. It was a blunt, unforgiving weapon, worn from use but reliable. He kept it close ever since the infection had started spreading through the ship. It had saved his life more than once. The infected crew. His mind flashed back to their faces before the infection. Faces he knew, people he trusted. Now they were something else, twisted beyond recognition. He had seen them through the small viewport in the bridge door, shuffling through the corridors. Their bodies deformed, their movements unnatural. And he had heard them, the scraping of their nails against the metal walls, the groaning of their twisted limbs as they wandered the ship, searching for him. He steeled himself, gripping the wrench tightly. He couldn't stay in the bridge any longer. He had to go out there, into the dark. The mess hall was only a few corridors away. If he could get there, he could grab some rations and water. It wasn't much, but it would keep him alive for a little while longer. He approached the bridge door, his heart pounding in his chest. He pressed his ear against the cold metal, listening intently. Silence. No shuffling footsteps. No scratching. Maybe the infected had moved on. Maybe he could make it to the mess hall and back without encountering one of them. The door slid open with a soft hiss, and Harker stepped out into the corridor. The emergency lights flickered weakly above, casting long, jagged shadows across the walls. The air was thick and stale, heavy with the smell of decay. The once clean metal walls were now streaked with grime, and the ship's usual hum of life support systems was reduced to a faint, ominous groan. Each step he took was slow, deliberate. His muscles tensed with every sound, his grip tightening on the wrench. The ship was eerily silent, but that only made it worse. The silence pressed in on him, heavy and suffocating. He could feel the ship breathing around him, the groaning of its structure echoing down the empty corridors. As he neared the mess hall, the door slid open with a metallic groan. The stench hit him immediately, an overwhelming smell of rot, decay, and something far worse. It clung to the air, thick and nauseating, making his stomach churn. The room was dimly lit by the flickering emergency lights, and in the pale glow, Harker could see the mess the infection had left behind. Tables were overturned, trays and food scattered across the floor, some of it moldy and decayed beyond recognition. The walls were smeared with dark stains, and the air was thick with the scent of death. Harker felt bile rise in his throat, but forced it down. He had to get in and out fast. Then he heard it. A wet, grotesque sound, like flesh being torn apart and devoured. Harker froze, his blood turning to ice in his veins. Slowly, he turned his head toward the far corner of the mess hall, where the sound came from. There, crouched over a pile of supplies, was one of them. This creature had once been human, a member of his crew, but now it was something else entirely. Its skin was a sickly greenish gray, stretched tight over a skeletal frame that seemed to have grown out of proportion. Bones jutted out at unnatural angles, and its limbs were long, too long, giving it an insect-like appearance as it crouched low over its meal. Its face was barely recognizable, its eyes sunken deep into its skull, glowing red with hunger. Its jaw hung loose, and jagged, broken teeth jutted out at odd angles, dripping with blood and saliva. It was feasting. Its claws, once hands, now twisted and deformed, tore into the flesh of what might have been food once, but was now little more than raw meat. The creature's movements were jerky, violent, its body spasming as if the infection had taken control of its muscles, forcing them into unnatural patterns. It was monstrous, an abomination of flesh and bone, something that should not exist. Harker's breath caught in his throat. His pulse pounded in his ears, and sweat dripped down his face. He gripped the wrench tighter, his mind racing. He had to get out of here. He had to... The creature's head snapped up, and its bloodshot eyes locked onto him. For a brief moment, time seemed to freeze. Then, with a horrific, guttural screech, the creature lunged at him. Harker barely had time to raise the wrench before it was on him, slamming into him with a force that knocked him backward. Its claws raked across his arm, tearing through his uniform and into his flesh. Pain shot through him like fire, but he swung the wrench with all of his strength, catching the creature in the ribs with a sickening crack. The creature let out a shriek, a high-pitched, inhuman sound that echoed through the mess hall. Its body convulsed, but it didn't stop. It lunged at him again, its teeth snapping inches from his face, its rancid breath hot and foul. The stench of rot and decay clung to it, thick and nauseating, and Harker's stomach churned as he fought to keep the creature at bay. He swung the wrench again, this time aiming for its head. The wrench connected with a dull thud, and the creature staggered, its head snapping to the side. Dark, thick blood sprayed from the wound, splattering across the floor. But the creature didn't fall. It screeched again, its claws flailing wildly as it came at him once more, its eyes blazing with rage. Harker's vision blurred with pain and fear, but he didn't stop. He swung the wrench over and over, each blow accompanied by a sickening crunch as bones splintered and flesh tore. Blood splattered the walls and pooled on the floor as the creature's body convulsed violently, its limbs twitching and jerking in grotesque spasms. Finally, with one last desperate swing, Harker brought the wrench down on the creature's skull. There was a sickening crunch as bone gave way beneath the force, and the creature collapsed to the floor, its body twitching once before going still. Panting, Harker staggered back, his heart racing in his chest. His arm throbbed where the creature's claws had torn into him, blood seeping from the deep gashes. He could feel the warmth of it soaking through his uniform, but the adrenaline kept it at bay. He stared down at the creature's body, his breath ragged. It lay in a pool of its own blood, its limbs twisted at unnatural angles, its face a broken, bloody mess. For a moment, Harker could only stand there, staring at the thing he had just killed. Then, his eyes fell on the tattered remains of the uniform the creature had been wearing. Through the blood and gore, he could just make out the name tag stitched to the fabric. Parker. His breath caught in his throat. Samantha Parker. They had been close, intimate even. She was the only person on the ship he had trusted, the only one he had confided in. And now she was dead, transformed into this thing. Harker swallowed hard, his stomach twisting. He forced himself to look away. There was no time for grief, no time to mourn her. He needed to survive. Harker bent down, quickly gathering a few ration packs and a container of water from the mess hall storage, his hands shaking as he moved. The stench of blood and rot hung thick in the air, and the sight of Parker's mangled body weighed heavily on his mind. He stuffed the supplies into a bag, careful to avoid looking at her again. His thoughts swam with a haze of grief and exhaustion, but he pushed them aside. There was no time to think about what had happened to her, to any of them. He had to get back to the bridge. He had to hold out just a little longer. Gripping the wrench tightly, Harker left the mess hall, moving quickly but cautiously through the ship's dark, eerie corridors. The lights flickered overhead, casting grotesque shadows that danced along the walls. Every creak of metal, every hiss of air escaping from a cracked pipe made his pulse quicken. He felt like he was walking through a haunted house, but the monsters here were all too real. The door to the bridge slid open, and he stepped inside, locking it behind him. He dropped the wrench onto the floor and slumped into the captain's chair, his body trembling with fatigue and fear. Blood still seeped from the gashes in his arm, but he ignored the pain. His heart was still racing from the encounter, the adrenaline slowly fading, leaving only exhaustion in its wake. Harker leaned forward and activated the comm system, hitting the record button with a trembling hand.
"This is Captain Harker. I've just killed one of the infected. It was Parker. I'm so sorry. I didn't have a choice.
She was too far gone. The ship is falling apart. Life support is failing. And I don't know if the repairs I have made will hold. I've sent out an SOS, but I don't know how much longer I can last. He cut the transmission and leaned back in his chair, staring blankly at the console in front of him. His arm throbbed, the pain growing more intense now that the adrenaline had worn off. He knew he had to do something about it, but there wasn't much he could do with the little supplies that were left. His eyes wandered to the monitors, watching the ghostly images of the ship's empty corridors. For what felt like hours, he sat in silence, listening to the creaking of the ship, the distant groaning of the metal as it twisted in space. The silence was unbearable, broken only by the occasional flicker of static on the monitors. Then, the comms crackled to life.
Galatea. Come in, Galatea. This is rescue vessel Argus. We've received your distress call, Captain Harker. What's your status?
Harker scrambled to the comms console, his hands shaking as he pressed the transmit button. Argus, this is Captain Jonas Harker of the Galatea, he said, his voice trembling with relief. I can't believe you're here. I can't believe you made it. Thank you for coming. You can't dock. The crew, they're all infected. Some microorganism from Helios Station. It's turned them all into monsters. You can't risk coming aboard. There was a long pause on the other end of the comms, the static crackling faintly in the silence.
Copy that, Captain Harker. How do we know you're not infected?
I'm not, Harker said quickly. The infection, it mutates the body. You know if I were infected. I still look human. You can quarantine me if you need to, but please, you have to get me off this ship. Another long pause. Harker's heart pounded in his chest as he waited for the response, every second stretching out painfully. Finally, the voice crackled through the comms again.
Understood, Captain. We'll keep our distance. You can come to us through the airlock. Argus out.
Relief flooded through Harker's entire body. He was going to be saved. He was going to get off this ship. He rose from the chair, grabbing the wrench one more time. His body ached and his head throbbed, but the thought of rescue pushed him forward. He moved through the ship's dark corridors again, heading toward the airlock. The lights flickered weakly, casting strange, distorted shadows that made the ship feel like it was breathing around him. His footsteps echoed in the silence, and every creak of the metal made his pulse quicken. As he neared the airlock, his heart stopped. A figure stood in the shadows just ahead of him. Its body was hunched, twisted and grotesque, its limbs too long, its bones protruding through the thin gray skin. It was another infected crew member. It hadn't seen him yet, but it was blocking his path to the airlock. Harker's breath caught in his throat, and his grip tightened on the wrench. He had no choice. He had to get through it. He had to get to the airlock. With a low growl, Harker rushed forward, swinging the wrench with all of his strength. The creature turned at the last second, its eyes glowing with a bloodshot hunger, its mouth hanging open, revealing rows of jagged, broken teeth. It let out a screech and lunged at him, its claws slashing through the air. The fight was brutal. Harker swung the wrench again and again, each blow connecting with the creature's body, sending it staggering back. But the creature fought back with equal ferocity, its claws raking across his chest, tearing through his uniform and into his flesh. Pain shot through him, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. With one final desperate swing, Harker brought the wrench down on the creature's skull. There was a popping sound and a crack, and the creature collapsed to the floor, its body twitching violently before going still. Panting, blood dripping from his wounds, Harker stood over the body, his chest heaving. He had done it. He had killed it. Something clattered to the floor next to the creature. Harker didn't pay it any mind. He was too focused on getting into the airlock. But if he had looked, he would have seen the small metallic syringe that had slipped from the creature's hand. Oblivious, he staggered toward the airlock, his body aching with every step. His breath came in ragged gasps, and his vision swam from the pain. But he had made it. He was almost there. He stepped inside the airlock and quickly put on one of the spacesuits lining the wall. Through the small window in the airlock door, he could see the infected crew members pressing their faces against the glass, their eyes wild, their claws scratching at the door. Harker backed away, sneering at them. "It's too late for you," he muttered, his voice trembling with anger. "You can't stop me!" He turned toward the outer door and looked out through the window. Beyond the ship, he saw the gleaming lights of the Argus waiting for him, his salvation. With a final glance back at the infected, he smirked. "Fuck you," he spat, and he hit the button to open the outer airlock door. The door hissed open, and the cold black void of space welcomed him. Harker drifted out into the darkness, his breathing slowing, his mind at peace. "I made it," he whispered to himself, smiling beneath his helmet. Back on the Galatea, the two remaining crew members, Reed and Miller, stood over the lifeless body of Dr. Allen. The airlock had sealed behind Captain Harker, and in the quiet aftermath, the truth was sinking in. Reed picked up the blood-stained syringe that had slipped from the doctor's hand, her face grim. "It looks like the doctor did it. He finished the antidote. He was trying to save him," she muttered, shaking her head. Miller looked down the corridor where Harker had disappeared. His expression was hardened with the weight of realization. "Harker really fucked us good. We're screwed, man." Reed stood slowly, glancing at the flickering lights and the failing systems around them. "The damage she did to the ship, it's too much. You're right. There's no fixing it now." She let out a breath. "We're not getting out of this." Miller, despite the gravity of the situation, looked over to the console. "There's still enough power for one last thing," he said. "I can send off the flight recorder drone. We might be screwed, but at least people will know what really happened." Reed nodded. "Do it." Miller moved to the terminal, his fingers deftly working over the controls despite the flickering displays. The hum of the small drone activating cut through the silence as it detached from the dock and shot off into space. It was gone in seconds, leaving only the soft echo of its departure. And so the truth began its journey across the stars. The drone carried with it the Galatea's flight records, footage from the ship's onboard cameras, logs, and transmissions. It held everything. It showed how Captain Harker had returned from Helio Station infected with a microorganism, how it burrowed into his mind, twisting reality until he could no longer tell what was real and what was imagined, how he grew more paranoid by the day, convinced his own crew had turned into monsters. They hadn't. The cameras captured it all. Harker's slow descent into madness, the deaths of his crew at his own hands, and the sabotage of the ship's critical systems as he tried to save it from his delusions. In the end, he had been the only one infected. The microorganism had consumed his mind entirely. Out in the void, the drone shot past Captain Harker, a blur of motion as it streaked towards its destination. But Harker didn't notice. His eyes were locked on the Argus, the rescue ship he believed was waiting for him, its lights bright and welcoming, promising salvation. A serene smile crept across his face as he drifted towards it. "I made it," he whispered, his voice soft and full of relief. In his mind, the Argus awaited, ready to take him home.
"Well, wasn't that a trip? You can float all you want in the big black, but Sometimes the most dangerous thing out there is the space between your ears. Our dear captain thought he was the hero of his own story, but, well, let's just say the truth has a way of catching up to you. At least Miller and Reed gave him the send-off he deserved. One last message for the folks back home. Sweet nightmares.
If you're enjoying the stories from the Ranger's Grove, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Thank you.